Hello, good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here. We can get started. There might be a few more people coming in. I'm Janice Katz, the Roger Weston Curator of Japanese Art at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the museum. I'm excited that you'll be joining us as we delve into how the Japanese painter Soga Shōhaku transformed Japanese painting as seen in Mount Fuji and the Miho Pine Forest, a pair of folding screens recently acquired by the Art Institute, and on view now in the gallery designed by Ando Tadao, which is Gallery 109. This piece stands out as one of the finest examples of Shōhaku's work in the United States. And as we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight's program. Kit Brooks is Curator of Asian Art at the Princeton University Art Museum. Kit specializes in Japanese art history of the 18th and 19th centuries and has previously held positions at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art, Harvard Art Museums, and the British Museum. Their recent projects include the exhibitions Staging the Supernatural, Ghosts and the Theater and Japanese Prints, and Io's Happy Rainbow Hell, the first U.S. museum exhibition dedicated to the psychedelic Japanese Fluxus artist, Io. Kit is also co-author of a book coming out next month, A Tale of Two Balconies, which compares the work of Hokusai and Whistler. So please join me in welcoming Kit Brooks to the stage.
Thank you so much, Janice, for that generous introduction. And thank you also to Frances McMahon Ward, Mel Harris, and everybody at the Art Institute who worked so hard behind the scenes to make these events run smoothly. And I'd also like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for giving me the opportunity to speak this evening and for the chance to see the screens in person this afternoon. I am very excited. Shōhaku is, to me, the greatest painter who has ever lived, and I could not be more pleased that these screens have entered into your collection. By anyone's metric, Shōhaku is one of the most remarkable painters of the 18th century. He is known for his expressive brushwork, his unusual motifs, and stories about his unorthodox behavior. His works are often invested with an unusual degree of vigor and energy, in some instances so much so that they can appear agitated or even manic. He has a truly unique style, but focusing only on those strange qualities can obscure the true depth of his refined technical abilities and his conscientious study of eclectic source materials. We can think of those as being like the underlying foundations to the bizarre pictorial edifices that he would go on to create. In today's talk, I would like to discuss some aspects that are often overlooked when we focus only on his more eccentric qualities. Shōhaku's artistic background and education is something of a mystery, and he is quite simply too good to be entirely self-taught. But the Mount Fuji and Miho Pine Forest screens are very significant as they offer an important link between Shōhaku and a wider network of artists working within this same compositional model and hint at the possible sources of his training. So with that preamble and the title of my talk, this print is probably not what you came to hear me speak about this evening, but it is a very famous view of Mount Fuji that should be more familiar to you than the one on Shōhaku's screens. This is, of course, Hokusai's Under the Wave off Kanagawa, or as it is usually referred to, the Great Wave. And there is currently a lovely impression on display in the Japanese galleries here, and as I've noticed this morning, on numerous posters throughout the city. The Great Wave is one of the most well-known artworks in the world, reproduced everywhere, from 1,000 yen banknotes to socks, underwear, Legos, and even the wave emoji that is on all of our smartphones. But this renown comes at a great cost. As a public, we are now so overly saturated with this image that we might not really look at it. You might not know that the Great Wave is but one image from a whole series by Hokusai, where each design illustrates a different view of Mount Fuji. From pastoral vistas to busy street scenes, Fuji is the unifying linchpin that is shown from every angle. But what angle is it here? Where are we as viewers? Nestled in the waves of this familiar view, we can see 3 narrow fishing boats, known as oshiokuri, catching fish off the coast of Kanagawa. These boats quickly transported fish to the markets in the nearby city of Edo, the early metropolis of Japan that would become known as Tokyo from 1868. However, the boats that Hokusai has depicted here will probably never return. They will be obliterated by this wave. The low sides of the boats would be unable to withstand such a huge influx of water, and they will surely sink. Swept out to sea by the tumultuous waves, it is unlikely that anyone will survive. During most of the 17th to 19th centuries, Japan was almost entirely closed to foreign exchange. And it was not just that foreigners were only allowed to enter Japan in very limited circumstances, but also Japanese people were not allowed to leave. They were forbidden from going abroad, and one means of enforcing this was to outlaw the production of ships that could survive in deep water and therefore be able to reach foreign shores. And knowing this should make us think about where Hokusai has placed us in this image as the viewer. What is our location? We are watching this scene unfold from a viewpoint offshore, one that Hokusai himself could never have occupied. In other words, this is not a sketch drawn from life in the European plein air tradition. Hokusai is imagining this perspective and manipulating the view for drama, very successfully, as I think we can all agree. The complexities that are underlying this familiar image are a reminder not to take landscape scenes at face value as accurate one-to-one representations of topography. But aside from drama, what other reasons might an artist have for manipulating a view of Mount Fuji, a view like this one? The reasons why Shohaku might have painted this view of Fuji to look this way will be the main focus of my talk this evening. And when viewing any set of folding screens, we follow East Asian writing order, so they're read from right to left. We have the expanse of the Miho Pine Forest on the right screen, moving towards a vast Mount Fuji on the left, a transition that is interrupted by a coiling dragon emerging from a storm. Although there are touches of color, overall the screens are executed almost entirely in black sumi ink. And this carbon black pigment has a very small, very regular particle size, which means the artist can mix it with different amounts of water to create a huge range of shades and gradations. And here, Shohaku has used that quality of ink to great effect, graduating the landscape to create a sense of distance, with the motifs in the foreground in dense, darker ink, and the distant hills in softer tones. There are also horizontal bands of mist that encourage that sense of distance by stacking sections of the landscape in tiers behind each other. But none of the images or the details that I can show in this presentation will do justice to the actual work, so please go and look at the screens in the gallery if you haven't had the chance to do so already. And additionally, the images of the screens on my slides are flat, so as to show the full composition in a single view. However, when displayed, folding screens are usually arranged in concertina fashion, and those alternating distances from you as a viewer also creates a very real physical sense of spatial recession, so it can be helpful to keep that in mind when viewing these works in reproduction. The Japanese art historian Yamashita Yoshiya introduced these screens in 2018 in an issue of the prestigious Japanese art journal Kokka. And one of Yamashita's observations was that the screens actually show the 4 seasons, spring, summer, autumn, winter, across 12 panels. In the lower right of the screen, we have the temple Ryugeji, which is surrounded by cherry blossoms, indicating spring. On the left side of the right screen, we can see the turbulent storms of summer, the rainy season. The trees and the boats are being blown about, and moreover, Shohaku has actually blown pigment through a straw for the clouds and rain that surround the dragon. Through this act, Shohaku has added a physically tangible reality to the depicted storm, transposing his breath into the fierce winds and collapsing them together. And moving to the left screen, in the lower right, we can see the sweeping curve of the Tokaido, the road that ran between the emperor's capital in the west, Kyoto, and the shogun's capital in the east, Edo, which we now know as Tokyo. Artworks that show Mount Fuji and the Miho Pine Forest often include a temple, the Seikenji, which is not present in Shohaku's screen. However, the Tokaido Road had 53 stations along the way, where travelers could rest and have their documentation checked. And one of these was Kiyomi no Seki. And that station was very close to the Seikenji temple, as you can see in this Meiji-era photograph. In his article, Yamashita speculates that by showing this curve of the Tokaido and Kiyomi, Shohaku is hinting at Seikenji here, alluding to its presence even if not depicting it in reality. This area also includes very subtle touches of vermilion, indicating the turning leaves of autumn. And finally, dominating the left side of the screen, and arguably the entire composition, is Mount Fuji, with its perennial cap of snow. It is winter spreading all over Suruga Bay. Actually, Suruga Bay doesn't and didn't ever get cold enough to have that much snow, but Shohaku is here using some artistic license, molding the contours of reality into that established seasonal template. And screens showing all four seasons are common in Japanese art, but of course, having all four seasons present in a single vista is another manipulation of space and time. All the landmarks depicted here are real places, but Shohaku has taken liberties with their placement, and even allowing for any environmental changes that have occurred in the over 250 years since these screens were painted, the true topography of this area is slightly different. We are floating high up in the air from an impossible vantage point, and looking from a southeasterly direction, where the Miho Pine Forest seems like it should be on the left, not on the right, where we instead find the Izu Peninsula. But it could be that we are wedged right in here, looking northeast towards Edo, with Fuji on our left, nestled in this little gap, with the spit of land that is covered by the Miho Pine Forest jutting in from the right. And this composition suits the folding screen format, weighting the composition with large, heavy motifs on the far right and the far left exaggerates the breadth between them, creating a broad, panoramic vista and the illusion of a wide space. Other artists working in different styles similarly manipulated the horizontal and vertical motifs to suit the formats and the media that they were working in and the priorities that they wanted to emphasize, be it the purely picturesque, tourism opportunities, or topographic accuracy. And the template of the Miho Pine Forest and Mount Fuji that Shohaku is using is a very standard one, transmitted through centuries of Japanese ink painters as a type of inherited composition from master to student, showing proficiency of a well-known subject. And that's one thing that makes Shohaku's use of the template so interesting. We know so little about his artistic training, but his decision to use the Mount Fuji and Miho model at this time in the 18th century is significant. On the one hand, this painting could be understood as an auspicious subject. The Japanese language has a limited number of syllabic sounds, and when these are combined into words, there are lots of homonyms and near homonyms, which frequently appear in Japanese art as a means to emphasize or to create new meanings. For instance, Fuji sounds like fushi, which can be written with characters that mean undying. This wordplay is connected to an ancient belief that there is an elixir of immortality at the heart of the volcano, and it's why images of Fuji can be used to convey wishes for longevity. Additionally, the character for dragon can be read as tatsu, which could also mean to sever or cut off, and can be used at the beginning of a new year to signify cutting off all the bad energy from the year before. In this screen, this sense of abrupt severance is emphasized by the verticality of that rising dragon. A rising dragon is also a metaphor for hard-earned success, as dragons were thought to reside in lakes for 1,000 years, practicing austerities before rising into the heavens. So we could read this painting as a combination of auspicious motifs, another version of the conventional Mount Fuji and Miho landscape. Shohaku often does very odd things with established subjects, and adding a dragon to this particular template is a very unusual thing to do. But it isn't the only time he interrupted this standardized panorama. Shohaku painted variations on the subject of Fuji, Miho, and Seikenji well over a dozen times, and many of these paintings are or have been in American collections. The most well-known example is this one, a set of 2 folding screens formerly in the collection of John and Kimiko Powers. They are now at the Miho Museum of Art in Japan, but because of their provenance, they are usually still referred to as the Powers screens. What you might have noticed right away is the large rainbow on the right screen, and it is very unusual, perhaps one of the first rainbows painted in Japanese art. There is a story about Shohaku and a rainbow that is typical of the type of behavior associated with him: drunk, rowdy, cantankerous, and eccentric. Shohaku spent much of his 30s wandering the provinces of Kyoto, Ise, and Hyogo, and he was often paid commissions to paint for high-ranking figures at religious institutions or for warlords. And I'm going to read an anecdote about Shohaku recorded in the late 19th century, as translated by Manny Hickman. At the order of the Lord of Hisai, Shohaku agreed to do a painting on a folding screen covered with gold leaf. As a guest of the Lord, Shohaku spent every day drinking sake and filling himself with fine food, after which he invariably went to sleep. Each day, the chief retainer wondered whether this might indeed be the day when Shohaku would get to work on the painting. And to get on Shohaku's good side, he would flatter him and serve him with sake and delicacies. But this would always have the same result, and the artist would make no move to paint. The chief retainer put up with this for some time, but finally it became too much for him. And one day he pressed Shohaku to the point where the artist finally resolved to go to work. He began by grinding a great deal of ink, which he poured into a mixing bowl. Then he took the expensive pigments that he'd been provided, dark blue, ultramarine, gold dust, and the like, which had cost 15 ryo, and he mixed them all indiscriminately with the ink in the mixing bowl. He then proceeded to stir it all with a broom made of hemp palm, while the chief retainer and the assistants watched in anticipation to see what Shohaku was going to paint. Shohaku placed the screens side by side, extending them across the room, and then he took up the broom and painted a single sweeping curve across the whole expanse. So vigorous was the stroke that it continued off the edge of the second screen and across the chief retainer's face. But Shohaku took no notice of this and turned and left. The chief retainer was extremely angry, but as Shohaku had already departed, there was nothing he could do. Meanwhile, the brushstroke was drying, and it began to take on an expressive form. And when the ink was completely dry, a brilliant 7-colored rainbow appeared. Sadly, that work no longer survives, and the story is impossible to confirm. But whether it is true or not, it reflects the image of Shohaku that has perpetuated over time. However, although this certainly demonstrates rash behavior on Shohaku's part, it also reveals a sophisticated understanding of material properties, how the different pigments would react together, coagulate, and dry. That extraordinary story is one of my favorites, and Shohaku was clearly an extraordinary character. His paintings are often distorted or bizarre, mostly his human figures and animals, but this is also true to a degree for his landscapes, which often feature starkly contrasting areas of light and dark, abutted right next to each other. And these could not possibly exist in reality. The art historian and pioneering Shohaku scholar, Manny Hickman, memorably described these kind of rock formations as petromaniacal conceptions. And I read that phrase years ago, and it is always stuck in my mind. Shohaku's extraordinary talent seems all the more incredible because he emerges seemingly out of nowhere, appearing in the history of Japanese painting in his early 30s as a fully formed artist, without an established pedigree or known period of apprenticeship, generating works that are apparently unaffiliated with any contemporary school of Japanese painting, in a very unique manner of expression that truly sets him apart from his contemporaries. Excuse me. For pre-modern Japan, we often look to an artist's name to give us clues about their training. As you may be aware, Japanese names are in the order of family name first and given name second. In the case of artist names, the first name is usually the studio name, which is then followed by the given name, often an art name bestowed upon them by their master upon completion of their training. The Soga name, used by Shōhaku, refers to a prestigious lineage of monk painters that dates back to the 15th century, centering around the Daitokuji monastery. But by Shōhaku's time, that lineage didn't exist anymore, and Shōhaku doesn't seem to have had any family links to those monks or to the Daitokuji. His fervent claim to be a Soga school painter is understood as just one of the many grandiose claims he made in his signatures, which seems to have been based in his desires and imagination rather than in reality. In some signatures, he claimed descent from the prestigious Fujiwara clan, and in another signature, he even declared that he was a descendant of the first emperor of China's Ming dynasty. Most of the things that we now know about Shōhaku's early life were uncovered by the art historian Tsuji Nobuo in the 1970s through his examination of funerary stelae and temple registries at Koshoji, the temple near Kyoto where Shōhaku and his family were interred. These sources tell us that Shōhaku died in 1781, that his family name was Miura, and that his father, Kichiemon, was the proprietor of a Kyoto shop named the Tanbaya, which was probably a textile dyer. Tsuji also built a chronology of Shōhaku's life and his movements around Japan based on the detailed inscriptions that exist on a few of his paintings and the locations where they were found. As inscriptions on funeral stelae relate to death, relying on that information predictably builds up a grim picture of a person's life that we are investigating. We learn that Shōhaku's childhood was scarred by repeated loss. An elder brother died in the capital of Edo when Shōhaku was 11, his father died 2 years later, and his mother, Yotsu, died when he was 17. Later in life, Shōhaku's own son died in infancy. It's probably because much of the small amount of information we have about Shōhaku is very depressing, that this has encouraged the image of Shōhaku as an embittered eccentric, wandering around the countryside alone, painting strange things and acting weird because he was completely mad. Since there are few textual records about Shōhaku's life, we have to look at them in combination with the evidence that can be found in the paintings themselves and mentions of him in Edo period texts that introduce different painters and their lineages. The earliest painting treatise to mention Shōhaku is the 1801 Diamond Vajra of the Way of Painting by Nakabayashi Chikuto. And Chikuto evaluates Shōhaku as a skilled painter, ranking him at the 3rd grade from a total of 9, a Japanese-style painter who was led astray by relying solely on his own talents. Chikuto also isolates Shōhaku from other contemporary painters into his own separate category, as a heterodox artist, which seems to imply that he did not have formal affiliations to a school or master. Shōhaku had died some 20 years before this book was written, when the author was only 5 years old, so this probably wasn't first-hand information. However, this description has significantly contributed to the narrative of Shōhaku as an unaffiliated individualist. Shōhaku is mentioned twice in an 1831 Index of Painters, the abbreviated Essentials of the Vehicle of Painting, where the author Shirai Kayo writes that because of the bizarre quality of Shōhaku's figures, he became a school unto himself, ippa ni nari. However, we shouldn't get too carried away by such references to his eccentricity, as it was a common trope among artists at the time, and it seems to have been an important factor in the public persona of some artists, particularly those based in and around Kyoto. And Nakabayashi Chikito, the same author who said that Shohaku was led astray by his own talents, wrote another book just a year later, where he hints at Shohaku's connection to a longer painting lineage. Chikito lists Shohaku as a follower of the artist Soga Shōhaku, who had died in the 15th century. And then he groups Shohaku together with a relatively obscure painter trained in the Kano school, Takada Keiho, a name that we will now be hearing frequently through the rest of my talk. The 1818 Guide to New and Old Painters of Japan explicitly identified Keiho as Shohaku's teacher. And one factor that adds some plausibility to this claim is that on at least 2 known paintings, Shohaku inscribes his work with a signature that includes the whole character of Keiho's name. One of these works is Shohaku's Immortals screens, widely regarded as his masterpiece. And this is a detail of the signature on the left screen, showing the whole character. Incorporating a character from a teacher's name is a common practice to indicate an affiliation or lineage relationship between artists, and doing so on such a major work is surely significant. But there are 2 main reasons why people have doubted a connection between Shohaku and Keiho. First, there is only a narrow time frame during which Keiho could have taught Shohaku. In 1753, when Shohaku was only 24, Keiho retired from painting to concentrate on a religious life. He's also known to have traveled to Edo sometime between 1741 and 1748, which is far from the western regions where Shohaku was active, further lessening the period during which the two could have shared a physical location. But between the recorded death of Shohaku's mother when he was 17 and his earliest dated work at the age of 30, there is a kind of a black hole in Shohaku's timeline. And that first dated painting is incredibly accomplished. So we have to assume that he did learn to paint very well from someone during that lost decade. With the death of his elder brother and parents when Shohaku was still so young, it is possible that the family business collapsed, and Shohaku would have needed to seek out an alternate profession at this time. But the second reason that people doubt the connection between Keiho and Shohaku is that Shohaku is not mentioned in the abridged biography of Keiho, nor in the list of students contained in the Keiho's painting manual, an instructional guide compiled by Keiho's followers in 1804. However, there may be very plausible reasons why Shohaku's name was deliberately excluded, namely that these documents were compiled by a rival lineage of students. The art historian Kuniga Yumiko discovered a list of Keiho's students at a temple called the Ninnaji, and this is the temple with which Keiho was most closely affiliated personally. But several names on that list are missing from the other list, and Kuniga concludes that a subset of Keiho's followers, a clique based in Omi province, put the official list of Keiho's students together, excluding people whose styles did not align with their vision for Keiho's legacy. And as Shohaku did not belong to that group, it should not be surprising that he was excluded. But we are here to look at pictures tonight, and I am more convinced by the shared idiosyncrasies in the painting styles of these two artists, and how that can be seen as another type of evidence linking them both together as master and student. Examining Keiho's landscape images reveals a number of the traits that are idiosyncratic to both Keiho and Shohaku's approaches. The foremost among them is a distinctive type of cloud, fluffy yet firmly delineated, with scalloped outlines. These clouds are present in many of Keiho's landscape paintings, as well as in his religious icons and portraits. This bubbly cloud form, which is very unusual in mid-Edo painting, is also prominent in a number of Shohaku's works. Another shared stylistic trait is the exaggerated contrast between passages of light and dark ink, particularly in the depiction of landscape elements, which seems to prioritize a contrastive effect over the convincing representation of topography. Many of Shohaku's landscape paintings, particularly in his later period, rely heavily on such sharp tonal contrasts. But the most convincing trace of an artistic relationship between Keiho and Shohaku is their shared use of the compositional template of Mount Fuji and the Miho Pine Forest, which at long last brings us back to our main subject today. We can see Keiho's use of the template in a hanging scroll in the Feinberg collection, where we can also see those scalloped clouds. There are many other examples by Keiho of this same formula. It is through this template and a period of study with Keiho that we can connect Shohaku to one of the most prestigious and storied paintings in all of Japanese art history, the Kano school. The template was widely disseminated by Kano school painters in the mid-17th century, and Keiho trained at the Kyoto branch of that school. The Kano was the most influential painting school of the Edo period, supplying painters in attendance to many of the leading warlords of Japan. If you have been watching the TV show Shogun, you will have seen Kano school designs providing the backdrops to the audience chambers in the warriors' residences. Although the Kano school disseminated the template, it seems to originate with the medieval monk painter Sesshu. Sesshu is one of the most foundational figures in Japanese ink painting, a monk painter who spent time in China before returning to Japan, influenced by the styles and the techniques that he had been exposed to on the continent. Sesshu's early version of Mount Fuji and Miho no Matsubara is weighted more heavily to the left, with less space given to the pine forest. But Sesshu may actually have got the basics of this composition from an even earlier painter, Noami, an artist and art appraiser for the Ashikaga shogunate in the 15th century. People speculate on this because of the existence of this screen, attributed to Noami, thought to be the right screen of a pair, but the left screen is missing. It has since been remounted as 6 hanging scrolls, but try to imagine these 6 strips as the panels of a folding screen. Clearly showing the Miho Pine Forest, Kiyomi, and the Seikenji, it offers this tantalizing possibility that an image of Mount Fuji was present on the left screen. We will probably never know. In any case, the template that we are now most familiar with was developed by Kano Tanyu, who firmly established this composition as a model to be used by generations of Kano school painters. The Kano school consisted of numerous studios where groups of painters often worked together to create large paintings that decorated the residences of the warrior class, but also attracted clients from the aristocracy, the Buddhist clergy, and affluent merchants. There are about 20 extant paintings by Tanyu on this subject, most of them dating to his later years, which were discussed by Yukio Lippert in his 2012 book, Painting the Realm. These paintings follow a standard pattern, featuring a 3-lobed Fuji, depicted in negative, from which the mountain's long right slope extends downward towards the right. The temple complex of the Seikenji, nestled in foliage in the lower left, offers a vertical counterpart to the horizontal expanse of the Miho Pine Forest at the lower right. Tanyu was based in Edo, but an important early painter within the Kyoto Kano branch of that school was Kano Sansetsu, who also replicated this compositional template. The motto of the Kano school was 1,000 artists, one brush, basically conveying the idea that all Kano school artists were drawing from the exact same playbook of compositions and techniques. It didn't matter which Kano school artist painted for you because they were all the same. Of course, this wasn't true. There were good Kano school painters and bad ones, but the Kano school training regimen really focused on copying. Students repeatedly copying the standardized templates that had been established by their teachers and replicating them with their own brush. An important compendium of painting models to be used for instruction in just this way was assembled by the Kyoto Kano school painters Sanraku and Sansetsu, here on the bottom, and it was passed down through successive generations of the Kyoto Kano studio. It contains that same Fuji model. Takada Keiho trained in the Kyoto Kano school with Kano Eike. Kano Eike was actually the head of the Kyoto Kano school in his day, and as Keiho was a pupil of the head of the school, rather than some other lower-ranking painter, he may have really internalized the proper transmission of Kano practices to his own students. Keiho replicated the same basic Fuji model many times, and his followers, even aside from Shohaku, also created many versions of this subject. For instance, his pupils Tsukioka Sete and Koizumi Ayaru. In these works, the horizon line is dramatically lowered. The peaks before Mount Fuji are figured in gestural brushwork, and a foreground tree line is absent. These characteristics are also found in Shohaku's several renditions of this subject, where the peak of Fuji, which is traditionally depicted with 3 humps, is instead often depicted by 4 or occasionally more. And actually, other compositions comparisons between Tsukioka Sete and Shohaku help strengthen the claim that Shohaku was a student of Takada Keiho. Sete is a known, uncontested pupil of Keiho. And the art historian Ito Shiori has pointed out that both Shohaku and Sete use red outlines in their depiction of female figures. This was originally a technique found mostly in Buddhist painting, and it was an uncommon practice for other types of painting at the time, suggesting that in this instance, Shohaku and Sete derived inspiration from the same source. Although Shohaku could only have studied with Takada Keiho for a very short time, it seems like this experience was profound and formative. The Kano school was particularly interested in lineage, obsessed even, not only through replicating copied templates, but through documentation. One critical text was the Honsho Gashi, or History of Painting of the Realm, an authoritative compendium of the biographical notes of Kano painters written by Kano Eno, based on notes compiled by his father, Kano Sansetsu. Kano Eno's son, Kano Eike, was the teacher of Takada Keiho, and I'm really sorry for all these similar-sounding names, and I hope that this diagram helps a little. The Honsho Gashi, that biographical compendium, was published in 1693, when Keiho was only 20 years old, just 2 years after he had begun studying with Eike, and we might assume that he was very impressionable. The Honsho Gashi declares the Kano school to be the pinnacle of painting in Japan, successfully synthesizing Chinese and native Japanese painting traditions. Aside from among the biographies, it gives information about Kano Sanraku, who we learn came from the same village as Takada Keiho. It seems possible that Keiho was able to secure an introduction to the Kano atelier through a blood relationship between his family and Sanraku's. Such connections and the overt interest in artistic genealogy that pervaded Kyoto Kano instruction was likely to have profoundly influenced the artistic consciousness of its members, particularly young pupils such as Keiho. Shohaku was also interested in the concept of lineage, both real and fabricated. In some of his signatures and inscriptions, he claims to have been a descendant of the aristocratic Fujiwara lineage, a declaration that is sometimes dismissed as yet another of Shohaku's grandiose and fictitious claims to a prestigious heritage. However, by claiming Fujiwara descent, Shohaku may actually have been following the precedent of Takada Keiho. According to the biography assembled by Keiho's students, Keiho switched his ancestral claims from the Minamoto clan to the Fujiwara when he took up service at Ninnaji, a temple affiliated with the Fujiwara clan. Generally speaking, the Kano school also claimed descent from the Fujiwara, and both Keiho and Shohaku's assertions might be echoes of that institutional tradition. Another potential link between Shohaku and the Kano school, and this is the last one, I promise, is the peculiar painted ciphers that Shohaku often used to augment his signatures. Again, this unusual practice is often attributed to Shohaku's eccentricity and his ferocious sense of individuality. However, it may also have been intended to evoke the urn-shaped seals that were notoriously used by early Kano school painters. The important compendium of biographies that I mentioned, the Honsho Gashi, comes in 5 printed volumes, but the 6th, supplementary volume, replicates the signatures and seals of Kano school artists. Some of these appear like the ciphers that Shohaku adopts. And these printed books were readily available to students, which may have included Shohaku, who is known to have drawn from printed painting manuals for his own compositions. Establishing a sense of identity is often an important part of analysing works by Shohaku, due to the ostentatious nature of his signatures and their placement. It is usually the case that artists place their signatures along the outer edge of folding screens. However, in your Chicago screens, Shohaku has placed his seals in much more obvious places, surrounded by white space, and drawing attention to them. Diligent scholars have rigorously analysed his seals, matching them up to dated works to build up a chronology. And most of the seals on the Chicago screens can be found on other works, except this one in red, which has never been seen before, so that's exciting. Even though the screens are not inscribed with a date, seals can be used for dating, as we can compare the condition of the seals to those on dated paintings. Made from wood, jade, ivory, or other materials, seals often have very thin carved lines. Used repeatedly over time or damaged in transit, those thin lines can break, a loss that is revealed when the seal is inked up and stamped. The seals on the Chicago screens don't have significant losses, meaning that they are from an early period in Shohaku's life, before he had used them very much. One of the seals also appears on a painting dated to 1762, but there it appears with a break, so we can surmise that the Chicago screens were painted before that time. And this chronology aligns with the early dates at which Shohaku painted most of his experimental works on this theme. The Powers screens with the rainbow, for instance, painted just a couple of years later than the Chicago screens, around 1762, again, in the early period of Shohaku's known paintings. We might speculate that Shohaku had learned and internalized the template from Takara Keiho, but already in this early period, he was disrupting it on a grand scale, inserting a dragon, a rainbow, novel interventions in an otherwise standard motif. Recognizing other influences on Shohaku, including the strong possibility of training under Keiho, does not diminish the impact of his works on us today, but instead enables us to gain a more textured appreciation of his artistic qualities, both in the way that they derive from and ultimately transcend the restrictive confines of a studio-based training system for such a young, ambitious painter. The emphasis on Shohaku's perceived personality as a tragic, isolated figure in his biographies is exacerbated by eliding the grotesque, distorted figures in many of his paintings with our perception of his own personality. Investigating the visual lineages for his non-figural subjects, such as landscapes, like the Mount Fuji and Miho Pine Forest, can help us avoid this temptation to superimpose the quirks of painted figures onto a historical person. Although not as familiar to us now as Hokusai's Great Wave composition is, the Mount Fuji and Miho Pine Forest template was so widespread among the Kano school training regime that its presence would have been just as ubiquitous to aspiring painters in Shohaku's time. The traces of Shohaku's connections to a wider network are embedded here and there throughout his paintings, subdued but not entirely submerged. The breadth of Shohaku's lineage claims, both textual and pictorial, both real and imagined, reveals a young artist using the building blocks at his disposal to reinvent his own unique identity.